Good morning, everyone. Don't your back pocket. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Megan. I'm the Director of Research Partnerships at the Diversity Institute. And it's a pleasure to have you here with us for What Employers Want, Immigrants and the Canadian Economy. We've gathered a group that doesn't always sit at the same table, employers, researchers, and people working directly with immigrant employment and entrepreneurship. The questions in front of us this morning, how immigration shapes our workforce, what employers actually need, are a pressing national priority and one that's been heavily politicized. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we gathered. From Metropolitan University is on land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The territory is covered by additional agreements through long developed covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. As we talk this morning about who belongs in Canada's economy and whose contributions we recognize, it's worth holding the history of this land in mind. The acknowledgement is the starting point, not a conclusion, and the work it points to belongs to all of us. To open our discussion, we'll start where every good conversation about immigration and the economy should, with the evidence. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Cukier. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Management here at Toronto Metropolitan University, and the founder of the Diversity Institute. She's one of Canada's leading voices in diversity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And she'll set the stage this morning with what the data shows about immigrants, employment, and economic growth. Please join me in welcoming Wendy.
I'm very old. As she read my bio, it would take all my time. So, anyways, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I do want to give a shout out to Megan and Diane who pulled this together. In our previous record was 10 days for an event. I think this was 6 or 5, maybe even. So we're really grateful that you all were able to come. And the occasion for us getting together was Patrick McKenzie was coming to town, and we couldn't not give him a platform, and because he in some ways is what I view as a bridge. Patrick spends a lot of his time with employers. And one of the biggest challenges I see in the sector day in, day out, frankly, is the two solitudes. So often you have organizations that are working with immigrants, they're very focused on what immigrants and refugees need, but they're often not very well connected to employers. And I'll just set the context with some of the research that we've been doing, and apologies to those of you who have heard me talk about this stuff on and on and on and on. But for me, the issues around immigration should not be partisan, nor should they be ideological, because what binds us all is the fact, and I hope you all will agree. You probably all agree now, but I hope you'll particularly agree after the presentations and discussions that immigrants are core to Canada's success as a nation and to our global competitiveness and to our quality of life. And, I'm the child of an immigrant in the city of Toronto. Half the population are immigrants, and another quarter are the children of immigrants. So we know the history of immigrants in this country and their contributions, but somehow in recent, I would say the last 2 years, a lot of that knowledge seems to have been lost or at least overwhelmed by voices who have suggested immigrants are the source of all our problems. So I just want to walk through my version of the facts. Other people have other facts, but my version of the facts based on research that we've been doing at the Diversity Institute, and lots of my team are here today. because this is really important to the work we do with the Future Skills Center, with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and so on. So the reality is we are in a time of unprecedented uncertainty, geopolitical conflict, things I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And we're working really hard, I think, as a nation to respond as quickly as we can to these changes. COVID was tough, but the environment we're in now, I think, arguably is even tougher. And coupled with the geopolitical situation, we are also on the cusp, I would argue, of really dramatic technological disruption. And I don't know, you can talk to these economists versus those economists about what the trajectory for AI adoption is going to be in this country, but based on what I have just observed anecdotally, I think the pace and the magnitude of AI are going to be beyond what most people anticipate. And then, of course, we've got the demographic issues, and I hate this. I think I am the only boomer in this entire. Are you? Yeah. Megan, Diane, never let this happen again. But with the aging population, I see stuff about seniors and elderly. My team writes papers about older adults and seniors and all that stuff. It's kind of frightening. But the fact is, the boomers are retiring and dying. I want to do the first before the second, although it's unclear some days that's going to happen. But that is the reality. The reality, it's been something that economists have been talking about since the turn of the century, that all workforce growth will come through immigration. That is simply a fact. Now, how much immigration do we need, not need? We can debate those points, but you've all seen the economist results for the first time in decades. Canada's population has leveled off or even fallen. And guess what? They're saying the decline in immigration might be tied somewhat to the recession, that they're not calling a recession, because people forget that immigrants buy stuff. They work, and they spend their money. And that actually is a boon to the economy. This is a little bit dated now. It's probably it's a couple of years old, but we just did a study of 1,700 small medium enterprises, and we still see similar patterns in terms of labor market shortages, challenges in having people with the right skills, challenges around retaining skilled workers. And this is something a lot of the SMEs we work with talk about, and part of the reason why, for example, they are skeptical about some of the programs that are tied to work integrated learning, because they don't want to invest. They don't want to invest in employees if they're not going to stay. And we've heard some people say, yeah, we make space for people, we train them, and then they go work at another company. So it's important to remember that despite the fact that we are seeing unemployment, particularly with young people, those labor market shortages continue. And we also know that concerns about job loss and the impact of tariffs and AI and so on vary quite considerably among different segments of the population. So 33%, which is not inconsiderate, of Canadians are currently using AI, for example, for work-related tasks, whereas 47% of immigrants are using AI. So when we think about the shortages that people are talking about, we know that immigrants have a lot of the skills that are needed. And this is the survey we did last year, 1,700 SMEs, digital skills still top of the list. One of the things that I would argue, and I think I have allies in this point, is when we talk about innovation in Canada, when we talk about productivity, when we talk about, where Canada is relative to the US and other countries, we often forget that the structure of our economies are fundamentally different. In the US, 50% of the private sector employment is with large corporations. In Canada, it's about 10. And yet we hear a lot, with respect, if there are bakers in the room, we are former bakers. We hear a lot about what the banks want, what the big IT companies want, what governments are doing, and so on. All of that is really important. But Canada is a country of small, medium enterprises. And we too often, in my view, ignore what they want and what they need. And that becomes very, very important whether we're looking at issues around immigration or even AI, because what we've observed, and others may see it differently, but everybody's saying, oh, there's no evidence AI is leading to reduction in workforce and layoffs and so on. I actually dispute that. I think we haven't seen the evidence yet, but I think if you look at the federal government, if you look at Rogers, if you look at a lot of big employers who are focusing very much on downsizing, some of it does have to do with AI. And when we look at the underemployment of youth, a lot of it has to do with the elimination of customer service jobs and a lot of those entry-level positions that some of us did when minimum wage was $1.30 per hour, right? Because how many people, just out of curiosity, how many people in the room when they graduated from university had those kind of basic service-oriented jobs? I picked strawberries, grapes, whatever. There were a lot of those positions that were part of the pathway to employment. So from my point of view, we really have to pay attention to SMEs. And by paying attention to SMEs, we also have to shift our gaze out of the Toronto Waterloo tech hub, because when we go to smaller communities across the country, SMEs are often the lifeblood of the economy. And what people forget is that if there's one hardware store in the community and it shuts down because there aren't enough workers or there's no succession plan, when that family, because a lot of small, medium enterprises are actually family-owned businesses, and we see a phenomenon where family-owned businesses are started often by immigrants, and then the kids go to university and they don't want to go back to the community that they grew up in. So succession in SMEs is massive concern in small communities, but it's not just a numbers game, because if the local hardware store or the only restaurant or grocery store shuts down because of lack of workers or lack of succession, that has profound impact on multiple ways in those communities. And I'm from the Diversity Institute. We basically argue that addressing issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion is just marketing 101. Right? Canada is changing. The market is changing. That's the market for goods, as well as the talent pool. Half the population is women. We control more of the money now, most of the purchasing decisions. Like, how can you not think gender is an issue? A quarter of the population are immigrants, or, and more are people like me who are the children of immigrants. 27% of Canadians now identify as having a disability. So if you are ignoring, and certainly Indigenous peoples are a smaller percentage, although they're the fastest growing segment of the population, and as well, the 2S LGBTQ plus community is relatively small from a statistical perspective. But do the math, add those up, and there's more of us than there are of them, whoever they are. So saying that equity, diversity, and inclusion is wokeness or political correctness or something just makes no sense to me, because it's about the market, and that is the market for goods and services, but it is also the talent pool that we have to draw from. So our arguments around equity, diversity, inclusion are just tied to that common sense notion that if markets are changing, you need to understand different segments in order to design products and services that will meet their needs. If you want to recruit the best and the brightest, and you're only fishing in 25% of the talent pool, you're going to miss out. And then we've got lots of evidence as well about innovation and entrepreneurship. And of course, the Canadian legal environment has not changed. So there may be executive orders in the States. We still have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We still have employment equity legislation and accessibility legislation and so on and so forth. So I don't think I need to go into this in a lot of detail, but what I would say to those of you, especially who work in the settlement sector, these arguments actually matter, especially in the current environment. Because what I would argue is that people in the settlement sector stand up and say, immigrants are important to Canada, give us more money so we can support them. That doesn't land particularly well because it looks very self-interested. But if everybody stands together and says, we need immigrants to build the economy, we need immigrants because of labor shortages, we need immigrants to drive entrepreneurship and innovation, we need immigrants to ensure we are global leaders. That to me is messaging that really should be pulling us all together in the same direction. And so that was part of the reason for the panel today to talk about business perspectives on this, because I think oftentimes there are those divides. We know that racialized people are overrepresented in technical areas, and there's a lot of racialized people are also immigrants. It's interesting when you break down particular populations. For example, within the South Asian community, almost half of the entrepreneurs are women as well, which is, same thing in the Black community, same thing in the Chinese community. The very high percentage of entrepreneurs are also women. We know that immigrants are critical to those high-tech, high-skilled jobs without question. And, it's funny because people may not think about this, but Jeffrey Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize, and Yoshua Bengio, who's very prominent in AI, are, guess what? Immigrants, right? So if you think about our brains trust, if you think about the things Canada is really proud of, a lot of it has to do with the contributions of immigrants. And this is, I think I mentioned this earlier, but what's interesting is immigrants are more likely to be using AI for a whole variety of reasons. And we just did a study with the Association of Canadian Studies in Montreal on immigrant use of AI for translation, for example. It's a game changer. Like some will say, oh, if you rely on AI tools, you're not going to learn the language, et cetera, et cetera. But think about it as an asset, how you can help people who may not have a native command of one of our official languages navigate, get access to services, customize things. I've been involved, some of you know, with sponsoring a lot of refugees, first the Indo-Chinese refugees, and since I was born before 1980, but the Indo-Chinese refugees, Syrian refugees, more recently Afghan refugees. And one of the biggest challenges has always been navigating the language, taking people to the doctor, getting them the information that they need. So there's huge, huge opportunities, not just to harness immigrant knowledge of AI to build the labor force and to help with our aspirations about responsible AI adoption, but also we can be thinking about how we can use AI to do a better job of supporting immigrants wherever they are. Tech, I've talked about. We do a lot of work looking at entrepreneurship. Immigrant entrepreneurs are more likely that the story about immigrants taking jobs is is bizarre because in fact, if you look at the evidence, immigrant-owned businesses are more likely to create jobs than small businesses owned by Canadians. They're more likely to export, they're more likely to innovate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in this current environment, when our former best friend is kind of turned against us, and we're looking for new trading partners worldwide, what's our competitive advantage? The immigrant diaspora. And I know this firsthand because when I was Vice President of Research and Innovation, I went on a bunch of trade missions, with the premiers and whatever. And I remember I was in China with the premier of the province of Ontario and a couple of mayors. And I got more meetings because I took Howard Lynn, one of my colleagues, with me. He just knew everybody everywhere. And not only did I get more meetings and more access to people, but he was able to interpret what was going on. Because I go to a meeting and I say, what happened? Did they like me? Did they hate me? Are we going to do a deal? Like, I have no idea what just went on. And having people with that local knowledge able to help navigate the markets. I mean, our trade commissioners are fantastic, but our immigrant diaspora is really our competitive advantage in entering those markets. And then, of course, there are the issues around specific skill gaps. And I really loved an interview. I apologize to the young people in the room, but I really loved an interview that the CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses gave, because a lot of people are saying, well, no, we don't need immigrants because we have youth unemployment and young people will fill the jobs. And you'll hear more about this later, but the fact is, young people don't want to work outside, don't want to do manual labor, and have very clear attitudes and ideas about what they will and will not do. It's no criticism. My daughter is my best friend, but she just, we did anything. We did anything when I was growing up. I hate being one of those people, but it was true. Like you felt lucky to have a job, even if it was picking strawberries or washing dishes. It was really an advantage. And the problem is, we do not have a pool of young people who are willing to do a lot of the jobs that we need immigrants desperately to help with. And it's not just those entry-level jobs. It's also, you can't replace a seasoned manager with a 22-year-old freshly minted university graduate. Well, sometimes you can. But in general, when we look at those issues around succession planning, I would argue we should be really doubling down on immigrants who have business knowledge and expertise, because they are more likely to be able to keep those businesses solvent. So it's really important, from my point of view, to not assume that the numbers tell the whole story. Like, you have unemployment and you have a labor market, or you have skills, but if they don't match, you have nothing. And so this idea that we can slash our immigrant levels and replace those people with these other people, there may be some cases where that's true, but in a lot of cases it simply isn't true. And when you think about the crisis in healthcare, when you think about some of the sectors that are really hurting, it's very clear that we need to think about immigration. We also know that there's problems with credential recognition. We know that there are gaps in our ability to integrate people that we come, that there are issues around how the point system worked, and the fact that, a PhD in English, which I love PhDs in English, but would get more points than a carpenter, even if carpenters were more in demand. So there are definitely some things that need to be addressed. But this, I think, is really scary and important to note. It's comparison of Australia and Canada, and the percentage of earnings after 5 years in different sectors. So in nursing, what we see is after 5 years, nurses earn about 90%. Immigrant nurses earn about 90% of what Australian-born nurses earn. Engineers, same thing. It's on average, after 5 years in Australia, immigrants in specialized trade skills, professions, earn about 90% of Australian-born people. For Canadians, it's 50%, right? Which means that after 5 years, immigrants to Canada who are engineers, who are doctors, who are dentists, etc., earn 50% of what Canadian-born people earn in those same professions. It's inexcusable and it's stupid when we are in such crisis with healthcare and so on. So there's lots that's been written about the barriers. I won't go into in detail. There are also the issues around discrimination. And what's important, I think, to recognize is that immigrants are also racialized. So if you're a Black immigrant, it's a double whammy in the sense, if you're a Black woman immigrant, it's triple whammy in the sense that the experiences of discrimination are not imaginary, they're very, very real. What's really encouraging for me is when we look at employers, businesses' primary goals are to make money. And I talked to like the local auto shop in St. Catharines where I'm living. And I said, you know, he was complaining about not having, being able to get staff. And I said, would you hire a newcomer? And he said, tomorrow, bring them to the door because he needs a job and he needs that job done. And what we find is while there may be some resistance to hiring immigrants because people have assumptions about language or culture or fit or whatever those, or Canadian experience or all of those things. What was really interesting about this research, which we did with the Memorial University, is that what we found is when small businesses hire immigrants, they hire more immigrants, right? Because once you get them in the door and they prove themselves, then a lot of the apprehension, concerns, whatever, dissipates. Small, medium enterprises hire immigrants, hire more immigrants. It's a thing. And that's why I'm really bullish on things like work integrated learning and placements and so on, because those are ways to get people in the door to de-risk the hires for SMEs. And then if people prove themselves, they will keep their jobs. But we know there's still issues with bias and assumptions. We also know that some of our policies are actually leading people to leave, right? People are coming to Canada and voluntarily leaving because they don't see the opportunities that were promised to them. And there's lots, like this has been really, I think, well documented. But from our point of view, immigrants are core to organizational strategies to mitigate risk, support growth, and to be resilient, and certainly to enter new markets. I want to say a few words before I hand over the floor to about backlash, because we hear a lot about backlash, right? A lot of our media spills over from the United States, and we hear a lot about what's going on there. What I wanted to say is, yes, it's true, there's been backlash against equity, diversity, and inclusion programs in the States, and we're seeing some Canadian multinationals do gymnastics in order to comply with US requirements as well as Canadian requirements. And so there's no question we see backlash, and I have a long analysis of that. We also know that media has really influenced the perceptions of immigrants and narratives that are simply wrong. How many of you have heard that immigrants were responsible for the increase in housing prices? Right? it made no sense to me because I know immigrants also build houses. Morley Gunderson and I did a paper looking at historic data and basically arguing that there were multiple factors affecting housing shortage, including chronic underinvestment in supply and so on and so forth. And we published that paper because we were seeing so much stuff in the media. Stats Canada came out with a report a few months later and confirmed 10% of the increase in housing prices could be attributed to immigrants. 10%. So if housing prices went up 40%, 4% of that could be attributed to the level of immigration, right? But that narrative had a profound impact on public attitudes, and there was a really dramatic shift. And that's part of the reason why I think it's so important to get together and reiterate some of the evidence. And we did an analysis of what happened in the media. What was really encouraging, but a little too late, was business stood up and said, that's not true at all. Unfortunately, it was kind of after the decisions were made based on the public opinion polls, but Canadian Chamber of Commerce has stood up on this issue, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Signal 49 or the Conference Board of Canada. There's quite a level of unanimity that emerged after the cuts were made to say that was taking a sledgehammer to a problem that required much more nuance. And, it's not just me and my, bleeding little heart that talks. But I thought this was really interesting. Their words, not mine. Immigration is a key driver of economic growth and our only source of workforce growth in the near future. It's more imperative than ever in the context of the aging of our population. The future of Canada depends on getting immigration right. And even more so, we saw individual SMEs in particular standing up and saying, what are you going to do? And in Quebec of all places, small businesses launched a class action suit against the federal government for the cuts, right? That was not political correctness or wokeness. That was, if we don't have people to do the jobs, we are going to lose money. So I think it's, one of the reasons I really wanted to shine a light on business today is to clarify some of those arguments and talk together about what the implications are for policy. The other thing I want to say is that in Canada, we still see businesses standing up. So when a Shopify CEO looked like he was joining the tech bros from the States and a lot of the EDI backlash, 250 Canadian tech companies signed a joint letter saying EDI is about business. And similarly, we just did a second round of surveys with Environics, 5,000 respondents. So we did it about a year and a half ago. We just repeated it, and everybody was a bit anxious, like, what are we going to see? What we see is the people who say that equity, diversity, and inclusion are mostly a good thing at work outnumber the people who say it's mostly a bad thing by a factor of 3 to 1. 3 to 1. And there's some sitting on the fence. But if you just read the stuff in the media, you would think there was a war on EDI in Canada, right? Public opinion, and especially the opinion of people working in organizations, is firmly behind Canada's commitments. And we repeated the study. We're all waiting because what if it had slipped? Same. It's robust. And it makes sense, right? Because I said it's marketing 101, and most of the people now in the country identify in one of the equity conservative groups. It makes sense that they think equity, diversity, and inclusion at work is a good thing. So you can come up if you have a solution to my microphone problem. I'm going to wrap up. So from our point of view at the Diversity Institute, we don't think there are simple solutions to complex problems. And we need to look at, thank you so much, it was the switch. We need to think about societal level policies, infrastructure, support. We need to think about what organizations do in terms of their hiring and promotion policies. And we also need to think about what individuals do, because my argument, frankly, is we kind of got in this pickle because there was a bit of lack of leadership. So you had a lot of people on one side saying immigrants are the source of all our problems. And we didn't have enough people standing up and saying, actually, immigrants are the foundation of our economy and our country. So we have lots of tools and approaches to work with organizations. We're pushing very hard for thinking about the whole employment and skills training system and what the competencies are that are required. We're going hard with the Future Skills Center on AI competency for all and what that means. And of course, thinking about inclusion when we look at career pathing and supports. But for me, what is really foundational, and the thing that I hope, there are two things I hope will come out of today with. Some are some practical solutions that we should be thinking about, or innovative approaches, or stuff that we know works. But the other is just this narrative, right? And it says it's a new narrative. It's not a new narrative. It's an old narrative that immigrants helped build Canada. I mean, they built the railway. They built the railway, which is often regarded as the foundation to Canada. They built the houses. Like, think about the construction industry 20, 30 years ago. It was dominated by largely European immigrants. And when we look at opportunities to address severe shortages and gaps, our failure to recognize international credentials, as I said, is not just destructive, it's stupid, right? We have so many physicians and nurses and others who are well qualified who can't practice their profession. And then the final thing is the immigrant thing is actually about it's not me, it's the Immigrant Ink book is actually about Silicon Valley. And a lot of people may not know this, but half of the people in Silicon Valley, the engine of US economic development, are immigrants. So I think we have to remember Canada is a country of SMEs. Entrepreneurs are our lifeblood, and we really, really, really need all hands on deck to weather the challenges that face us going forward. So thank you very much.